My name is Rowan Ellis, and I didn't want to be there. I don't mean that in the usual, everyday sense of dragging your feet to some social obligation. I mean it in the marrow-deep way that your gut clenches before something goes wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't announce itself with a bang, but with a whisper and a smile. Maribel, my wife, for what that still meant back then, stood in the driveway with a red thermos and a checklist in her hand, barking out last-minute instructions like a field commander. Micah, grab your jacket. Zane says it gets cold up there after sundown. Micah, our 10-year-old son, scampered by with a flashlight nearly half his size. His eyes were bright, cheeks flushed with excitement. To him, this was an adventure. To me, it was a trap we both hadn't seen clearly yet. I loaded the last cooler into the back of Zane's SUV, the one with the cracked taillight he never bothered fixing, and shut the hatch with more force than necessary. I didn't trust them. I hadn't for a while. Maribel and I were barely talking unless it was about bills or Micah's school. Her layoff only made things worse. She didn't blame the company, she blamed me. Said I had my head buried in hollow point systems, my startup, too deep to notice she was sinking. So, in what I assumed was an attempt at mending or masking things, she suggested this trip. To reconnect, she said, putting a hand on my arm like she remembered how. We all need this. We included her old college friends Sierra and Brooke, plus Zane, her half-brother, who never quite grew out of the frat boy phase. I wanted to say no. I almost did. But then Mike overheard, and his face lit up in that way kids do when they still believe the world is good and fair and full of magic. We're going camping? All of us. What could I say to that? I said yes. The drive was long, winding, and full of empty conversation. Zane led the way in his car, and we followed in ours, stocked with enough supplies for a long weekend in the wild. Micah kept asking if we'd see bears. I told him hopefully not. Maribel stared out the passenger side window like the trees had answers she couldn't find in me anymore. We arrived late afternoon, the kind of golden hour that makes even broken things look whole. Olympic National Park sprawled in every direction with thick green, a world where reception died and silence grew. The cars were parked on a gravel clearing, ringed by towering pines. A shallow river hummed nearby, soft and forgettable. Sierra was already there, setting up her tent with military precision. Brooke, in sunglasses too expensive for the woods, was scrolling through her phone even though we all knew the signal had already dropped. Zane cracked open a beer, passed another to Maribel, and gave me a wink that didn't feel friendly. "Welcome to paradise, man," he said, raising his can. I forced a smile. I hadn't wanted to be there, and now I was standing in it, surrounded by forced laughter and inside jokes I was never part of. Micah ran to help Sierra with her tent. She smiled at him like she hadn't spent the last 3 Christmases avoiding our family. That first night, we sat around a fire Zane built with what he claimed he chopped himself, even though I saw the plastic-wrapped logs in the back of his truck. Maribel sat close to him, too close. Brooke played some terrible pop song from a Bluetooth speaker. I watched the flames dance while the beer in my hand went warm. Micah leaned against my side, yawning. "Dad, this is the best," he murmured. I kissed his forehead and told him I was glad he was having fun. He deserved this. I didn't. Later that night, after Micah fell asleep in our tent, I stood outside under a sky too clear to lie beneath. I looked at the shapes moving near the fire, Zane whispering something into Maribel's ear, her laughing and swatting his arm. Sierra watching. Brooke slipping off into the trees to take a phone call that wouldn't go through. It was all wrong. Like a play I hadn't been cast in but somehow had to sit through. I went to bed with a headache and a knot in my chest. The next morning, over instant coffee and oatmeal packets, Maribel said we should all do our own thing for a bit. "Take Micah on one of your little walks," she said, using that tone she reserved for hobbies she didn't respect. "There's a short trail by the stream. Won't take more than an hour." I didn't argue. What was the point? Micah was already lacing up his boots. I grabbed my small pack, tucked in a map and a canteen, and we headed out. The trees swallowed us quickly, and for a while, I forgot the tension, forgot the dull throb in my skull. Micah quizzed me about animal tracks and asked if he could build a fort when we got back. I told him we'd see. 45 minutes later, we returned to the clearing, and everything was gone. The tents, the cars, the gear, the people, all of it, except for a single note sitting in the middle of the picnic table, held down by a stone. I didn't pick it up right away. I just stood there, my mouth dry. Micah looked around, confused. Where'd everybody go? I finally stepped forward. The handwriting was familiar. Zane's. Sloppy. Smug. This is for the best. Trust me. My legs went numb. My ears filled with static. Micah tugged at my sleeve. Dad? Where's Mom? I looked down at him and smiled because that's what I was supposed to do. That's what he needed me to do. Maybe they went looking for us, I said. He nodded, trusting me, believing me. Still a boy. But I knew. I knew in that moment what I couldn't say out loud. They left us. On purpose. Micah was still chewing on the last of the granola bar when we returned. His little hiking boots stomped against the trail like he was some explorer discovering new land. He kept laughing about a squirrel we'd seen that darted across our path. The sun had shifted slightly, the shadows stretching longer over the clearing. But when we stepped back into the camp, the sound of his laughter died. So did every sound in my head. The tents were gone. Not flattened. Not zipped up and stored. Gone. The cars? Gone. The food, backpacks, sleeping bags, even the fire pit had been covered with dirt. It was like no one had ever been there. Micah froze beside me. Where's everyone? I couldn't answer. My feet refused to move at first. My eyes searched the space like maybe this was some sort of elaborate prank. Like they were hiding behind trees, holding in laughter. But the air didn't hold any joy. Just silence. Just the faint, sharp sting of pine and something else, something wrong. Then I saw it. A piece of paper on the picnic table, fluttering slightly in the breeze, held down by a fist-sized stone. I already knew who wrote it before I got close. I didn't even need to read the words yet. I recognized Zane's stupid looped letters from a mile away. Micah followed close behind, his hand in mine. I picked up the paper. This is for the best. Trust me. No date. No explanation. No apology. Just betrayal written in black ink. My heart stopped for a second. Not skipped. Stopped. And in the quiet that followed, the noise started, the roar of thoughts, of confusion, of rage trying to claw its way out of my chest. Micah looked up at me with wide eyes. Where's Mom? I felt the panic crawl up my spine, but I forced it back. I had to. For him. I couldn't let him see me fall apart. I crouched down so we were eye to eye. Maybe they went looking for us, I said, the lie already tasting like poison in my mouth. He nodded slowly, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. Kids don't need evidence to sense something is wrong. They just know. I scanned the perimeter. Nothing left behind. No spare food, no water, no extra clothes. Even the first aid kit we kept near the tents gone. They had taken everything. Methodically, deliberately. I walked to where our tent had been, dropped to my knees, and started clawing at the dirt. Nothing. They hadn't just left. They had erased us. Like we never existed here. Like this was always meant to be a one-way trip. I took a deep breath, one that tasted like betrayal and bark, and stood. We'll stay here for a little while, I told Micah, in case they come back. He nodded and sat on the ground, pulling his knees to his chest. I knew they weren't coming back. I knew at the moment I read the note. Hours passed. The sun dropped lower, shadows creeping like quiet hands through the trees. I walked the perimeter twice, hoping maybe they had left something. A clue. A bag. A bottle of water. Nothing. Micah got hungry. I gave him the other granola bar. I told him I wasn't hungry. He didn't believe me, but he didn't argue. He just handed me the last bite before finishing the rest. As night fell, the cold came in sharp. I took the thin emergency blanket from my hiking pack and wrapped him in it. We curled under the wooden shelter near the table, where the roof sagged just enough to block the dew. I held him close, rubbing his back while he drifted to sleep. My eyes stared into the dark. What kind of people leave a child behind? It wasn't just Maribel. It was all of them. Zane, Sierra, Brooke. People we'd laughed with, trusted, made memories with. How long had they planned this? Did they talk about it over wine? Whisper about it in group chats I didn't know existed. And why? That question gnawed at me. Was it me? The tension in our marriage? The way I buried myself in work? Did they think I deserved this? That Micah did? I couldn't sleep. Every crack of a branch made my fist clench. Every whisper of wind made me reach for the Swiss Army knife in my back pocket. I didn't cry. I wanted to, but I couldn't afford it. At dawn, I got up, walked to the river, and splashed freezing water over my face. I stared at the reflection in the water, my eyes sunken, my jaw tight. Micah stirred when I returned. Are they back yet? Not yet, I said. I knelt and helped him to his feet. We had to move. We couldn't stay there, hoping. I knew hope was a trap. What we needed was distance, options, and a plan. I gathered what little we had, the knife, the map, the empty canteen, a small flashlight, and packed it into my hiking bag. I tore the note in half, then into quarters, and buried it under the dirt. Micah looked up at me, worried. "Where are we going?" I tightened the straps of the bag. "We're going to find help," I said, my voice steady. "And we're going to be okay." I wasn't sure if I believed it yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever Maribel and the others thought they were doing, they underestimated one truth. You don't abandon a man like me and expect him to disappear. They left us to vanish. I was about to show them just how wrong they were. I told Micah we were going to explore. That was the word I used, explore. Not escape. Not survive. Not flee the crime scene our lives had become. Just explore. Something a kid could understand. Something he could carry without it cracking his little heart. We had 2 granola bars, now 1, a bottle of water barely half full, and the Swiss Army knife I always carried clipped to my belt loop. That was it. No compass. No backup. No signal. Just forest. Towering, endless forest, with the early morning sun filtering through the canopy like stained glass. Micah didn't ask questions. He trusted me. His face was pale, his backpack half empty, and still he looked at me with the kind of belief that made my chest tighten. I couldn't fail him. Not after being left behind like forgotten luggage. We followed the stream, same one from the short trail hike. I figured water would always lead somewhere, a ranger post, a road, a town. I kept him close, within arm's reach. Every crack of a branch made my hand instinctively move to the knife. We walked for hours. The trail disappeared fast. Deer tracks faded. Trees crowded tighter together. I cut through brambles with the knife, parting thick vines as we climbed up an incline slick with moss. I kept my voice light for Micah. "This is just like that survival show you love, huh?" He nodded, then whispered, "But the guy on the show has a camera crew." I laughed. "A real one. First in days. Well, you've got me. I'm your crew." By midday, the bottle was empty. I didn't want to push him too hard, so we stopped by a pool where the stream widened. I made him rest while I filtered water through a cloth, let it settle, and prayed it was clean enough. He sipped slowly. "We should catch fish," he said, hopeful. Like in the show. One step at a time, but we kept going. I spotted thimbleberries in a patch of sun. I made sure they weren't bitter nightshade first. Then we picked until our hands were stained red. They tasted like tart sugar. Micah smiled again. That night, we stopped by a break in the woods where a cluster of flat rocks surrounded a patch of dry moss. I gathered bark, dead branches, and soft pine needles. I scraped the knife against a rock for what felt like hours until the spark caught. When the fire finally flickered to life, Micah clapped. I let him believe it was magic. "See? We're gonna be fine," I said. We shared the last granola bar. I gave him the bigger half. He handed me a bite anyway. "Dad, do you think Mom got lost, too?" I stared at the fire too long before answering. "I think Mom made a mistake. But right now, we're going to be okay because we have each other." He nodded. He understood more than I wanted him to. He curled up beside me, wrapped in the emergency blanket again. The stars above looked fake, like someone punched pinholes in a black sheet. I stayed awake long after his breathing steadied. Every sound felt like a threat. Every rustle was a bear or worse. But what really gnawed at me wasn't outside the firelight. It was the question of why. Why would she leave? Why would Zane, Sierra, Brooke, people who'd held my son, celebrated birthdays with us, toasted to anniversaries, plot something so precise, so heartless? It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment betrayal. This was planned. Every tent folded, every car started, every trace of us removed. This was orchestrated. And then there was the note. "This is for the best. Trust me. Trust me." The words boiled under my skin. Zane, with his condescending smirk and lazy charm. He was the kind of man who thought the world owed him something for surviving it. He always hated that I did well. That I built Hollow Point from my garage and turned it into something that mattered. Maybe he thought he was doing me a favor by disappearing me. Screw that. The next morning, Micah woke up shivering. I gave him the rest of the berries and a few sips of our filtered water. We moved slowly. His feet were sore, but he didn't complain. I made him a walking stick out of a branch, showed him how to balance on it. "You're a real outdoorsman now," I said. He grinned, proud. We kept near the stream. I figured it had to lead us out eventually. Around noon, we found a patch of wild onions. I dug some out with the knife, rinsed them in the water, and chewed slowly. Sharp. Bitter. But it filled the hollow. Micah spit his out. "Tastes like feet." "That means it's working," I said, laughing. We made camp near a rock wall that night. The wind was louder there, the kind that whistles warnings. I built another fire, smaller this time. I noticed Micah wasn't eating as much. Tired? I asked. He nodded, then lay down early. His eyes closed fast, but I could see the heat rising off his forehead. I pressed my palm to it. Too hot. I dug through the pack and pulled out the small Ziploc of dandelion root I'd gathered earlier, not really expecting to use it. I crushed it, poured water over it, and boiled it in a dinted tin cup. The tea was bitter and dark. I raised his head and helped him sip. You're gonna feel better soon, Micah. I promise. He murmured something in his sleep. A name. Mom. I turned away, blinked back the rage. I stayed up again. Firelight dancing. My hands clenched around the knife. We were going to survive. Not because we were lucky. Not because I had some divine plan. But because I was going to will us through it. Because someone needed to answer for this. Because I needed to walk back into civilization with my son beside me, alive. So they would know exactly who they failed to kill. And what they had unleashed instead. By the third day, I was beginning to understand just how cruel the wild could be. It didn't hate you. It didn't love you. It simply didn't care if you lived or died. And that quiet indifference pressed down on me as I carried Micah through a ravine, his weight lighter than it should have been, his breathing shallow against my neck. He had stopped talking sometime late the night before, his voice barely more than a whisper even when he tried. His skin was burning up. We had been surviving on thimbleberries, wild onions, and stream water boiled over shallow fires. I'd even managed to catch a frog once, roasting it on a stick for protein. But it wasn't enough. Micah was small for his age, and this was taking a toll. I told myself it was just fatigue, just hunger. But when he started mumbling in his sleep, feverish and incoherent, I knew it was more than that. We reached a patch of flat ground, and I laid him down gently in a bed of ferns. His face was flushed, beads of sweat forming along his hairline despite the cool mountain air. He shivered, then curled up like he was trying to disappear into himself. I sat beside him, hands trembling, and rummaged through our pack. Nothing helpful. No medicine. No antiseptic. No gauze. I only had what nature could offer, and that terrified me. I remembered an old survival guide I read years ago. Dandelion root could help reduce fever. I had gathered some days earlier and used it sparingly. I chewed a bit now, swallowing the bitterness, then crushed the rest into a tin cup with stream water and set it over a fire I coaxed from damp bark and dry grass. The smoke curled up slowly, lazily, like it had all the time in the world. Micah stirred and called out, barely audible, "Mom." The word was like a knife. I wanted to rage, to scream her name into the trees, to ask how she could do this, how she could leave her own child behind without a second thought. But I didn't. I couldn't afford that luxury. He needed calm. He needed strength. He needed me. I helped him sip the tea when it cooled, holding the cup steady as his hands trembled. He coughed once, then closed his eyes again. His breathing slowed, and for a moment I thought he was slipping further away. I grabbed his hand. It was too hot. "You're okay, Micah," I whispered, trying to make myself believe it. "You're strong, just like your mom used to say." I hated that I said it, but he needed something familiar to hold on to. He didn't respond, just lay there, curled up beneath the ferns, his face a picture of fragile sleep. I sat beside him all night. I didn't doze. I didn't blink for long. I just watched him breathe. Every time his chest moved, a tiny weight lifted. Every time it paused, I leaned in with terror clenching my heart. I prayed, not the kind of prayer you say in church, all memorized and clean. No, this was raw, ugly, wordless, a bargain with whatever force might be listening. I hadn't spoken to God in years. But that night, I begged. I promised. I swore if Micah made it, I would become the man he deserved. And I swore I would make the people who did this pay. By morning, the fever hadn't broken, but it hadn't gotten worse. That, in this twisted new war. Micah opened his eyes mid-morning. They were glassy, but he focused. "Water," he croaked. I gave him what I had. He drank slowly. "Are we still exploring?" he asked. It almost broke me. I nodded. "Yeah, buddy. Still exploring. Just taking a little rest." He nodded and closed his eyes again. I could tell he wanted to believe me, and maybe he did. Kids have to. That's how they survive the hard parts of the world. I cleaned him up as best I could, wiped his forehead with the edge of my shirt, now damp from stream water. I even tried to make a little shade tint with branches and my jacket. That day moved slowly. The fire kept dying. The wind picked up. I stayed close to Micah, gathering more berries, rationing water. By late afternoon, his fever finally began to drop. He was sweating less, his skin cooler. I didn't cheer. I just exhaled. I leaned back against a tree, the bark rough against my back, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to cry. Not loud. Not for long. Just enough to let the weight shift slightly off my chest. Silent tears for a man who had lost everything but the one thing that still made him human. I didn't sleep that night either, but I did close my eyes for a while, just listening to him breathe. And sometime before dawn, I felt it. Something inside me had changed. It wasn't rage. I'd had that already. It wasn't grief. That too had come and gone in waves. No, this was colder. Heavier. Like steel. I would get us out. And when I did, I wasn't going to simply call the police. I wasn't going to scream at them or plead for justice. I was going to dismantle their lives. Piece by piece. They didn't just abandon me. They abandoned Micah. Chapter. And that was unforgivable. I looked at my son curled beside the firelight, still wrapped in that silver blanket, and I made a vow to the trees, the wind, and whatever God had listened to me in the dark. They wanted me dead, but I was more alive now than I'd ever been. Day 6 began with the silence of decision. Micah was finally resting better, the fever having passed, but he was still weak. His cheeks were hollow, sunken with exhaustion. I gave him water and the last of the spruce tips we had saved, and for the first time in days, he looked up at me without the glaze of illness in his gaze. "Where are we going today, Dad?" he asked, his voice still raspy but stronger. "Somewhere better," I said. And I meant it. The ridge we had camped near the night before sloped upward into a range of hills. I'd spent the last few days studying the landscape with the old trail map I found buried under the seat of my pack. It was frayed, almost useless, but I could make out the basic features. Streams, elevations, symbols for cabins and ranger stations. We weren't where we started anymore. I was sure of that. But if I read the terrain right, the smoke I had seen the evening before was a fire tower or possibly an old ranger lookout. If it was active, it meant rescue. If it wasn't, it was still shelter. Either way, it was hope. Micah tried to stand on his own but winced. His right leg had been bothering him since the hike on day 2. He never complained, not once, but I could see the way he shifted his weight, the grimace he thought I didn't notice. I took off my belt and looped it through the straps of his pack and mine, fashioning a makeshift sling around his shoulders and waist so I could carry some of his weight. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to get him moving. We climbed slowly. The incline was steep, littered with fallen branches and patches of loose rock. My boots slipped more than once, but I caught myself. I had to. I couldn't fall with him depending on me. He was silent for most of the climb, saving his breath. Every so often, I heard a quiet, "You okay, Dad?" "Yeah," I'd grunt back. "You?" "Yeah." We reached a small ledge by midday and paused. I gave him some water, let him rest in the shade while I climbed a little higher to scan the horizon. And there it was. Smoke. A thin gray column rising over the ridge to the north. Controlled, steady. Not wild like a fire, but purposeful. A signal. A camp. Maybe even a tower. I felt my knees weaken, but not from fear. We were close. I slid back down to Micah and smiled. "See that smoke up there?" He nodded slowly. "We're going there." He leaned against me, and I could feel the relief in his small frame. We pressed on. The climb was brutal. My legs screamed. My lungs burned. My hands were torn from grasping branches, scraping bark, lifting Micah every time the terrain got too steep. I never let go. Not once. At one point, the sling came undone and I slipped, landing hard on my side. My ribs protested. I bit down on the inside of my cheek and forced myself up. Micah was crying quietly. "I'm okay," I said, brushing myself off, breathing through the pain. "You're bleeding," he said, pointing to my elbow. "Just a scratch. We've come too far to stop now." The final stretch was the worst. A narrow path over jagged rock. One wrong step, and we'd tumble into the ravine below. I told Micah to hold my shoulders tight. I took each step slow, one foot in front of the other, until we crested the hill. And then I saw it. A silver glint in the trees. Metal. A tower. It stood half-shrouded in evergreens, a fire lookout with aluminum siding and a faded red roof. Smoke curled from a chimney pipe. There was life here, or at least a chance of it. I almost collapsed from the sight. "That's it," I said. "That's where we're going." We descended the final slope slowly. The forest grew quieter, like even it was watching. I knocked on the door with trembling hands, shouting. No answer. I circled the base and found a hatch to a staircase leading up. I hoisted Micah onto my back and climbed. At the top, the door creaked open with a groan. Empty, but not abandoned. Inside, a cot, a shelf with cans, beans, almonds, soup, a first aid kit, a flare gun. I nearly dropped to my knees. This was salvation. I laid Micah on the cot. He looked up at me with tired eyes. We made it, he whispered. I gave him almonds and water. Then I tended to his foot with iodine and gauze. He winced, but didn't cry. That night, I used the flare gun. I stood on the platform, pointed it to the sky, and fired. The flare hissed upward, blooming into a red flower of hope against the darkening sky. I watched it fade and waited. 30 minutes later, I heard it. The sound of rotor blades slicing through the silence. A helicopter. It emerged from behind the ridge, dipping low over the treetops. A spotlight cut through the branches, scanning. I waved both arms, shouted until my throat went raw. They saw us. The bird hovered, then descended slowly, kicking up dust and pine needles. A medic jumped out, ran to the tower, and pulled Micah into their arms. I followed, limping, dizzy. I don't remember being lifted into the chopper. I just remember Micah reaching for me, his small hand finding mine. And then black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital room. For in my arm, heart monitor beeping. Micah was asleep beside me, clean, warm, safe. I didn't know how many days had passed. A nurse came in. She called the doctor. But it wasn't the doctor who arrived first. It was a man in a dark suit, holding a badge. FBI. Mr. Ellis, he said. Do you know your wife filed for your death last week? I stared at him, the words not making sense. She what? He nodded slowly. We need to talk. And that was the moment I knew. They hadn't just abandoned us. They had tried to erase us. The hospital bed creaked beneath me as I tried to sit upright. My body felt like it belonged to someone else, stiff, bruised, hollowed out from the inside. But none of that mattered. Not now. Not after what the agent had just told me. My wife had filed for my death. Not missing. Not endangered. Dead. And not just mine, Micah's too. The man in the dark suit stood at the edge of the room, his arms crossed, badge clipped to his belt. His name was Agent Coleman Rowe, and he had a folder under his arm that looked too thick to mean anything good. We received the insurance claim last Wednesday, he said. Your wife submitted it through an attorney. Claimed you went missing on a hike due to stress and mental instability. Said you took your son with you after a series of emotional outbursts. I wanted to laugh, but my throat was too dry. There were letters attached to the claim, he continued, opening the folder. Signed notes, supposedly from you. A will. Even a psychiatric report from a Dr. Wilkes. He dropped the copies on the tray table. They claimed you had a mental break, that you wandered off into the woods to die. I stared at the pages. I didn't need to read them to know they were fake. But there, in shaky cursive that looked almost like mine, were words I had never written. They thought we wouldn't find you, Cole said. They thought you wouldn't survive. My eyes shifted to Micah. He was still asleep in the chair beside me, wrapped in a hospital blanket and 4 in his arm. His face looked peaceful, but the thought of him listed as deceased in some government database made my blood run cold. How much? I asked. Cole raised an eyebrow. The insurance, I clarified. How much were we worth to her? $2.2 million, he said, and another $600,000 in a separate policy through Hollow Point Systems, the one tied to your ownership. I closed my eyes. And the others? I asked. Zane, Sierra, Brooke, all named in the investigation. All corroborated the story. He flipped to a page with Zane's signature. Your brother-in-law claimed he saw you leave the camp alone with Micah. Said you were distraught. Maribel backed it up with text messages that were conveniently saved. Sierra and Brooke said they stayed behind because they were uncomfortable. He paused. They even hired a notary to certify the new will. I laughed then. A bitter, broken sound. Let me guess, Maribel was the sole heir. Cole didn't smile. Correct. I leaned back against the pillows, my pulse thudding in my ears. We're compiling everything now, he continued. But the fact that you and your son are alive complicates their plan. You were supposed to disappear. It's a lot harder to press a claim when the body walks back into the world. I looked down at my hands. They were still scraped and dirt-stained. They left a child behind, I said. They walked away from him. That's not just fraud. It's attempted child endangerment, Cole said, nodding. Possibly more, depending on the DA. And now that the boys recovered enough to speak, we'll get a statement. But I need your help. Anything, I said. We need your full testimony. Everything from the trip. Every detail you remember. We'll pair it with the GPS data from the helicopter and the medical evaluations. If we build the timeline tight enough, we can dismantle their entire story. I nodded. And Maribel? Cole met my eyes. She hasn't been arrested yet. We didn't have enough until now. Something in me shifted. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was war. 3 days later, I was discharged from the hospital. Micah too. He clung to my side like a shadow as we stepped out into the sunlight. I was 20 pounds lighter, limping on my left side, and bruised everywhere, but I was upright. We were taken to a safe house while the investigation continued. Cole visited daily, walking me through documents, transcripts, surveillance footage, and timelines. We stitched together every lie they had built. We had the receipts. Hardware store purchases made days after we were supposedly lost, showing Maribel and Zane buying replacement gear. We had footage, Brooke at an ATM, withdrawing cash to pay the notary. We had a paper trail, digital signatures on the insurance claim, timestamped just 2 days after Micah and I had vanished. And we had the bombshell, Micah's voice, calm but clear, telling the child psychologist that he and Daddy went on a short walk and came back to an empty campsite. When Cole heard the recording, he said, "That's it. That's what we needed." I asked one question. "When do we bring them in?" He looked at his watch. "We already are." That afternoon, they executed the warrants. Zane was picked up from a gym downtown. Sierra was cornered in her classroom. She taught 4th grade. God help those kids. Brooke was pulled off a red-eye flight to Vegas. And Maribel? She was at brunch, wearing my mother's earrings. Laughing. Cole showed me the footage later. She didn't even flinch when they read the charges. Just calmly placed her mimosa on the table and asked if she needed to finish paying the bill. "You're under arrest for insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted child endangerment, and falsifying legal documents," the agent had said. "I understand," she replied, like they were discussing a parking ticket. When she saw the cameras outside, though, her face changed. That was the moment it hit her. I was alive, and I was coming for everything. I stood outside the courtroom in a navy suit that barely fit anymore, the fabric looser than it should have been, my reflection in the courthouse window looking unfamiliar. Micah was with my sister inside, reading a comic book quietly on one of the benches. He didn't need to hear any of this. He'd lived through enough already. Inside the courtroom, my wife sat surrounded by the very people she once swore were just old friends. Zane, with his arms crossed like he owned the room. Sierra in her charcoal blazer and dark sunglasses like this was some sort of fashion show. Brooke chewing gum, disinterested as ever. And Maribel, my wife, sitting front and center like this was a job interview and not a reckoning. She didn't look at me when I walked in. None of them did. My lawyer, Marcy Lynn, dropped a thick folder in front of the judge with a sound that made the room flinch. "Your Honor," she began, "what you are about to review isn't simply evidence of a forged will or a fraudulent insurance claim. It is evidence of a coordinated attempt to profit from the staged disappearance and presumed death of my client and his 10-year-old son." The judge, an older man with a lined face and heavy eyes, nodded. "Proceed." Marcy opened the folder. First came the surveillance photos. Maribel and Zane at the hardware store, buying rope, tarps, water jugs, and trail supplies, 2 days after Micah and I had gone missing. Then came the receipts, gas station logs, credit card swipes, timestamps that didn't align with their original statements. After that, the audio. A voicemail Maribel had left on Sierra's phone a day before the camping trip. "Make sure the gear is packed in Zane's car. Rowan's gonna take the bait." Micah too. The courtroom was silent. Not a cough. Not a whisper. The judge leaned forward. "Play that again." Marcy did. And this time it landed harder. Then came the forged psychiatric letters, supposedly written by a Dr. Wilkes, claiming I'd shown signs of emotional breakdown, paranoia, instability. The judge narrowed his eyes. "We've subpoenaed Dr. Wilkes. He confirmed he's never met my client. His signature was copied from an unrelated document, and the license number listed is for a pediatrician in another state." Maribel shifted in her seat for the first time. Zane stopped tapping his foot. Marcy wasn't done. She handed over the signed will that claimed I had revised my estate 6 days before the trip, leaving everything to Maribel. And the notary? The judge asked. She's here, Your Honor, Marcy said. A woman in her early 50s took the stand. Her voice shook at first, but steadied quickly. I was paid under the table to stamp the document. I never witnessed a signature. I never met Rowan Ellis. I was told it was a rush job for a man leaving the country. She started to cry. I didn't know there was a child involved. The judge removed his glasses. Thank you, Miss Dyer. Zane muttered something under his breath. Brooke looked at the ceiling like it could offer her a way out. Sierra finally took off her sunglasses. And Maribel stared straight ahead. Then it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand slowly. Every step reminded me of the ache in my ribs that never quite healed. I sat down and looked around the courtroom. My name is Rowan Ellis, I began. And what happened to me and my son wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding or a miscommunication. It was a plan, a deliberate plan to remove me from my own life. I told the court everything. The trip, the hike, the note, the food rationing, the fever, the fire tower, the flare. But when I got to the part about Micah asking for his mother, I had to stop. I looked at Maribel then. He asked for you, I said softly, while he burned with fever, while he lay in the dirt, thinking you were coming back. And you weren't. Marcy touched my shoulder. I nodded and turned back to the judge. We survived because we had to. But I wanted on record, the people sitting over there didn't just try to steal my company. They tried to erase me. And they were willing to let a child die to do it. The silence afterward was thick. The judge called a recess. During the break, Maribel finally looked at me. Her eyes were cold, not regretful, not ashamed, just calculating. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. Mr. Ellis, any comment on the trial? One asked. I paused, then said, they tried to replace me. Now let's make sure they don't get away with it. Back inside, the judge announced his ruling. The evidence presented establishes clear grounds for a criminal trial. This court finds sufficient cause to move forward with formal charges: insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted endangerment of a minor, and falsification of legal documents. He looked directly at the defendants. You are remanded into custody until your trial date is set. Zane stood up to protest but was cut off by two bailiffs. Brooke looked stunned. Sierra began crying. And Maribel? She finally blinked. I walked out of that courtroom not as a victim, but as a man who had pulled his son from the jaws of betrayal and brought the truth into the light. We weren't just left behind. We were supposed to be gone, but we came back stronger. The trial began on a wet Monday morning, the kind of gray that seeps into your bones before you even step outside. I adjusted Micah's tie in the back row of the courtroom and gave him a reassuring nod. He wasn't testifying, thank God, but he wanted to be there. He said he needed to see it through. So did I. Maribel entered first, flanked by her attorney. No makeup, hair tied back in a low bun. She wore a beige blazer 2 sizes too big. It was an act, and I saw right through it. She sat without looking at anyone, not even me. Zane shuffled in next, his cocky energy finally deflated. Sierra followed, eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. Brooke barely raised her head. The four of them looked like ghosts in their own horror story. Marcy Lynn began the opening statement. This is not simply about fraud. This is about betrayal of the deepest kind. About 4 adults, including a mother, who left a child and his father in the wilderness to die, not because of desperation, but for money. The prosecutor called me as the first witness. Again, I retold the story, this time not just. One juror, a woman in a green blouse, wiped a tear from her cheek when I described carrying Micah up the ridge. Another nodded silently when I talked about boiling stream water, when I described the flare arcing into the sky. Then came the evidence. Email threads between Sierra and Brooke. Brooke, is it done yet? Sierra, he won't last 10 days out there. Not with a kid. Laughter emojis. Then text from Zane to Maribel. Zane, we'll file Monday. The sooner the better. Maribel, use the second draft of the psych letter. The one with the family history section. That text hit the jury like a slap. When the notary took the stand again, she detailed how Sierra arranged the meeting at a diner and paid her $2,000 in cash. They said it was urgent, that Rowan was leaving the country and didn't trust banks. Maribel's attorney tried to paint her as a manipulated woman, caught up in something orchestrated by her reckless brother and pressured friends. But then the prosecutor pulled out the real card. A video. Security footage from 3 days before the trip. Maribel alone. At a bank. Speaking to a financial advisor about liquidating the trust left by my late grandfather, the one she claimed to know nothing about. He won't need it, she had said on camera. He's going through something. The jury didn't buy her performance. Not after that. Zane's attorney attempted damage control, claiming his client believed I was suicidal and had simply panicked. The jury was then shown a clip from Zane's podcast, a cringeworthy episode where he joked about camping and letting nature take care of things. "Don't leave your brother-in-law in the woods unless you're ready to cash out," he'd said. The room froze. Sierra and Brooke didn't even try to defend themselves. Their lawyers went for plea bargains mid-trial, hoping to avoid full sentences. Too late. The damage was done. When the time came for closing arguments, Marcy stood tall. They didn't just try to steal money. They tried to erase a man. And worse, they tried to erase a child's future. They gambled that no one would come looking, that the wilderness would do the work for them. But the wilderness didn't. Rowan Ellis came back. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdicts: Maribel, guilty on all counts. Zane, guilty. Sierra, guilty. Brooke, guilty. I held Micah's hand in the front row as the judge delivered sentencing. This court has never seen such a blatant, calculated abuse of trust. For the attempted endangerment of a minor, insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and the falsification of federal documents, the following sentences are imposed. Maribel, 15 years, eligible for parole after 10. Zane, 12 years. Sierra and Brooke, 10 years each. As they were led away, handcuffed and silent, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Outside, reporters swarmed. A microphone was thrust in my face. "Mr. Ellis, how do you feel? What do you want the public to know?" I looked down at Micah. 10 days in the woods taught me who my real family is," I said. "And it's not defined by blood. It's defined by who shows up, who stays, who fights." I didn't answer any more questions. I just took Micah's hand and walked away. We weren't victims anymore. We were survivors. And no one would ever erase us again. 10 days. That's how long Micah and I had spent in the wilderness. 10 days surviving on scraps and instinct, on the invisible thread between father and son. 10 days being erased. And now it had taken 10 hours to sentence them. 10 days of pain for 10 years behind bars. The headlines rolled in fast. Mother sentenced in fraud plot against husband and son. Ellis family betrayal uncovered in wilderness survival case. Software CEO survives murder plot, leads to convictions of 4. Every variation, every photo, every quote. I read none of it. I didn't need to. I was living the story every day. The house we moved into wasn't large, but it was ours. A 2-bedroom home near the coast, a small front porch, and a yard where Micah could finally be a child again. I painted his room in sky blue. Let him pick the bedding himself. Dinosaurs, of course. A creature that had once ruled the earth but still managed to disappear. Micah got a dog. A shaggy brown rescue he named Comet. They became instant friends. The kind of bond only a boy and a dog can understand. Comet followed him everywhere. Even waited outside the bathroom door. Hollow Point Systems was still mine. Maribel had tried to claim ownership, but the courts threw that out before it even made it past preliminary motions. Her forged documents, her falsified stake gone. I resumed operations quietly, no outside investors, just a skeleton crew of people who had always believed in the core product. We didn't make headlines. We didn't need to. Every line of code I wrote now felt like rebuilding a bone that had once been shattered. Micah was doing better. He smiled more, laughed more, went to bed without asking if someone was going to take him again. But every now and then, I caught him staring off, holding the old hiking compass I gave him, the one we used to follow the stream. He still carried it in his pocket sometimes, like a talisman. One night, we sat on the back porch after dinner. I grilled chicken. He helped slice cucumbers. We ate with Comet at our feet and a breeze moving through the tall grass beyond the fence. Micah looked up at me, voice small. "Why did they do it, Dad?" I didn't pretend not to know what he meant. I set my plate down. "Because they thought we were in the way," I said quietly. "Because they believed their lives would be easier without us." He nodded like he'd already guessed that. "But we weren't in the way," he said, more firmly now. I looked at him, at his firm little jaw, and the fierce glint in his eye, and I saw the man he might become someday. A man who knew how to stand when everyone else expected him to fall. "No," I said. "We weren't." The silence after that was full of peace. Later that week, we drove into town to visit my sister. Micah wore his favorite hoodie, the one with a stitched compass on the sleeve. We stopped at a small bookstore on the way, and he wandered to the back where they kept old field guides. When I joined him, he held up a worn copy of a wilderness survival manual. "So next time," he said, grinning, "you don't have to guess." I laughed, tousled his hair. "There better not be a next time," I said. "Yeah," he said, "but if there is, I'll be ready." He would be. More than I ever was. At night, I sometimes lay awake staring at the ceiling. I didn't dream about the forest. Not anymore. But I remembered it. The cold. The hunger. The sound of my son breathing beside me in the dark. The moment I thought I might lose him. And the moment I knew I never would. People asked me if I was going to change my name. If I was going to disappear and rebuild somewhere else. But I didn't want to disappear. I wanted to live. Openly. Fully. On my terms. The justice system had done its part. But healing? That was on us. And we were doing it. One breakfast. One walk with Comet. One line of code. One smile. The past was always there, sure. But so was the future. And we were writing it ourselves now. Micah started drawing again. He showed me a picture one evening while I was working in the garage. It was of a man and a boy on a hill, a fire behind them and stars above. "That's us," he said. "What's the fire mean?" I asked. He thought about it. "It means we didn't go out." I smiled, throat tight. "No, we didn't. And we never would." The courthouse felt colder than it had during the pretrial. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe it was the fact that this time, we weren't just making accusations. This time, we were sealing fates. The trial had ended. The sentencing was done. But what followed was a stretch of 10 days that felt like walking through a museum of everything we'd survived. Each day brought a new news article, a new message request, a new apology from someone who had once doubted me. People I hadn't heard from in years reached out. High school classmates. Former coworkers. A cousin who once told me I was boring. They said things like, "We always knew you were strong," or, "I can't believe they did that to you." But none of them were there when Micah cried himself to sleep on a bed of moss. None of them were there when I cut my hand open splitting kindling with a pocket knife that was too dull, too small. None of them sat by the fire we built out of desperation and listened to the forest breathe like it was deciding whether we deserved to survive. 10 days. That was how long we had lasted in the wild. 10 days of eating wild roots, of sucking dew off leaves when our water ran out. 10 days of carrying my son on my back when his fever made him too weak to walk. 10 days of staring into the dark, waiting for some sound, some movement. That would mean either death or rescue. And now, 10 days of the world trying to wrap it all up with a bow. 10 days of press conferences, of victim statements, of being called resilient like it was some compliment instead of a scar. 10 days of not sleeping because the nightmares still came like thunder rolling just out of reach. Micah handled it better than I did. Or maybe he was just more honest about it. He asked questions. Lots of them. Questions I didn't always know how to answer. "Why did they do it?" he asked one night, sitting cross-legged on his bed with a flashlight balanced under his chin. I sat at the edge of the mattress, staring at the cracks in the hardwood floor. "Because they thought we were in the way," I said. "Because some people only see others as obstacles." "But we weren't hurting them," he said. "No, we weren't. But we were inconvenient. And to people like that, inconvenience is enough." He was quiet for a while. "I think they thought you wouldn't fight back." I looked at him. "What makes you say that?" "Because they always talk over you. At dinners. At parties. You used to go quiet when they joked. They thought you were weak." It was the kind of observation that made my stomach turn. Because it was true. I had let myself shrink in that family, in that marriage. Bit by bit. Year by year. I told myself it was easier. For Micah. For peace. For love. But really, it was fear. Fear of being too much. Fear of being alone. They fed off that. Until the woods stripped everything else away and left me with nothing but instinct. Day 4 of the post-trial week, I visited the Hollow Point office. What was left of it? The building had been empty since the restructuring. The board Maribel tried to claim as sheriff was dissolved. The documents she'd submitted to prove co-ownership had been invalidated in court. Fraud, forged signatures, misrepresentation. But the damage had still been done. I walked past empty desks, past dry plants and cracked ceramic pots. The server room hummed quietly, like a living thing trying to remember its purpose. I stood in the middle of the main room and just listened. I remembered staying late in this space. Pulling Micah in a wagon when he was a toddler. Maribel used to drop him off with a kiss on the head and then vanish to her yoga retreats or networking dinners. I used to think we were building something together, but only one of us was actually building. The other was already digging escape tunnels. I spent the next 2 days reclaiming what was mine. I reactivated the core infrastructure, called 3 of my old engineers. 2 said yes immediately. The third, Anita, cried when she heard my voice. I thought you were gone, Rowan. I was at your memorial. I laughed softly. So was I. Just in the trees. We started from scratch. I gave them access to the architecture. I cleared my calendar. No meetings. No external investors. Just a new version of the company that bore my fingerprints instead of compromise. On day 6, I got a letter. From Maribel. It came through my lawyer, typed but signed in her hand. She said she didn't expect forgiveness. That she didn't even fully understand what made her go through with it. That the idea took root over time and grew like mold in the corners of their conversations. She claimed it started as a joke. What if he just disappeared? And then Zane ran with it. Sierra encouraged it. Brooke offered logistics. And she agreed. No apology. Just that. A confession of sorts. Or maybe just a desperate attempt to rewrite her role in the narrative before history sealed it. She ended it with a question. How's Micah? I didn't reply. Because she didn't deserve to know. Day 7, I took Micah to the beach. He ran ahead with Comet chasing seagulls. I sat on a dune, watching the 2 of them zigzag across the wet sand. A woman from the neighborhood sat down beside me. Her name was Rachel. She'd brought her daughter to play. You look like you're carrying a whole mountain on your back, she said gently. Feels more like a forest, I replied. She didn't ask questions. Just offered me a bottle of water in silence. Sometimes that's all you need. Day 8. Micah had a nightmare. I woke up to him calling my name, his small voice cracking. The trees were eating the stars, he whispered. And you disappeared again. I sat beside him until his breathing slowed. Then I pulled the sleeping bag from the closet and camped on his floor for the rest of the night. Neither of us said anything more. Day 9. The media frenzy died down. The story that had once burned through headlines like wildfire began to flicker out. Another scandal. Another politician. Another tragedy. We were yesterday's miracle. But that was fine, because we weren't built for the spotlight. We were built for the fire. Day 10, we built a fort in the living room. Not because we were hiding, but because we could. Micah brought blankets and flashlights. I brought snacks. Comet guarded the entrance like a loyal knight. We read a book about explorers who mapped unknown lands. Micah stopped at a page and said, "You know, we did that." Did what? Survived. Like them. Only no one drew our map. We made it up. I looked at him. This boy who had carried no weapon but courage. Yeah, I said. We made it up. And we survived. He nodded. 10 days, Dad. We beat 10 days. That's like 100 in real life. He wasn't wrong. Those 10 days didn't just test us. They made us. 10 days of hell had earned us this life. And I would never let anyone take it away again.